lived experience must inform reforms for all psychological injuries in the workers' compensation system. But to do so, we need to understand violence against women and the intersectionality as it applies to workers' compensation. Let's change the story.
Preventing violence against women is a long-term goal. It's social change, it's cultural change, and it's really generational and transformational change that we need. So it isn't going to happen overnight. To make that change, we need governments to fulfil their human rights obligations to women. We need them to fund and support prevention. We need them to do the policy and structural change. But we also need everybody else to play a part: workplaces, individuals, communities, families, and sporting organisations. Everybody needs to work together, and Change the Story gives them the framework to do that, to bring together that long-term change that is so necessary.
Change the Story is based on a rich body of evidence from 40 or 50 years of scholarship on domestic and sexual violence. And what Change the Story does is synthesise that. It kind of tells a coherent, evidence-based story about what we know, and Change the Story has put on the map a language of what it means to prevent domestic and sexual violence, of the drivers of those forms of violence, and the effective strategies we can use to prevent and reduce that violence.
What's encouraging is that we can now move the conversation on to how do we prevent that violence and what works in prevention and what kinds of strategies can we put in place.
In my work, I use Change the Story in three main ways. The first way is to explain to people what drives violence against women and children. The second way I use it is to say that it's a national priority. And the third way I use it is to say that we all have a responsibility to do something about it.
It's also really important as part of our messaging to the broader community, because we really need that strong evidence base to help shift attitudes and behaviours in the community. So really using that Change the Story to think about those different settings and where we can best affect change in the Tasmanian community.
I've used Change the Story in three ways. First, I've used Change the Story as a kind of manual for how to do primary prevention in talking to practitioners, in working with policymakers and so on. Second, I've used it as a source of evidence, a source of scholarship about what we know drives domestic and sexual violence and the strategies we know will help prevent it. And third, as an education tool. Here's a handy framework that identifies what you can do. Here's a good explanation of what drives those forms of violence.
Since we've started the Tangentyere Family Violence Prevention Program, we have been using the resources and the research from our watch to help us develop Mums Can, Dads Can and Girls Can, Boys Can, which is our primary prevention projects, so that these projects are grounded in research.
Well, the first edition is 5 years old now, and the second edition was a chance to update the evidence, review the evidence that's come out in that time and see what we can learn from that. So I'd point to two aspects that we've really expanded. The first is a focus on men as the perpetrators of violence against women and the harmful forms of masculinity that are driving that violence and underpinning that violence. And on the flip side of that, the need to really engage with men as part of the solution, to talk to men and boys about the harmful forms of masculinity and how they need to be a part of preventing violence against women. The second aspect is how we've woven in an intersectional approach in a lot more detail. So of course we're still focused on the way in which gender inequality is a key driver of violence against women. But we've talked a lot more about racism and homophobia and colonialism and so on, and how they intersect to drive violence against women.
Change the Story has helped us explain to people about gender equality being the key drivers of violence against Aboriginal women. Basically, what we do is we talk about the colonisation. I mean, you know, people say colonisation is scary stuff to talk about, but it's also educating ourselves and educating the non-Aboriginal people as well, because this is our women and our girls and our children that we have to start looking after and making sure that they're having that respectful relationship as well.
Change the Story talks about how all our prevention efforts should be inclusive of women with disabilities, and it talks about how we should prioritise high-risk population groups. We experience all the same types of violence as all women do, but we also experience additional forms of violence due to the disability discrimination we experience.
Join us in creating a future
where all women and children
Can live free from violence.
Together, we can change the story of violence against women in Australia.
You can change the story too.
This is the story of a boy and a girl. It's a universal story and an Australian story. It's a story that occurs every 2 minutes, in fact. A story that happens 657 times a day, every day of the year, and in every kind of household and every city and region across Australia. This is the biggest story behind violence against women. This story doesn't have a happy ending. Because this is the story of how gender inequality contributes to the murder of one Australian woman almost every week. Sounds like a tall tale, right? Let's take things back to the start. Here's the story of a regular woman. As a girl, she gets told how pretty she is, never how clever she is, that if she wears a short dress, she's asking for it. She grows up and gets used to being harassed by men on the street. That's just the way it is. Here's the story of a regular man. As a boy, he learns that women aren't equal to men from a very early age. Even though both his parents work, on the weekends his mum does the housework while dad watches sport. When he cries about being bullied at school, his dad tells him to stop being such a girl and just punch him right back. Technically speaking, we'd say that these social norms, practices and structures have shaped both the boy and the girl, creating a society where women are valued less and men are expected to be dominant and in control. In such a world, disrespect and hostility is excused and violence against women is far more likely. But back to our story. The girl grows up into a woman, the boy grows into a man, and they begin to date. He jokes that he hopes she doesn't get fat now that we're together. She's not sure whether she should laugh. They have the same education and do similar work, yet he earns more money. He's quickly promoted, like other men in the company, while she gets overlooked. At home, she does all the household chores, and he takes control of their joint finances, seeing as he's the main breadwinner and all. When they're at the pub, he puts her down in front of his mates. His friends stay quiet. In the morning, he wakes up and blames the alcohol. And stress, he always has an excuse. When she gets pregnant, her boss says she can't come back part-time. After the baby is born, the lack of flexible job opportunities and childcare keeps her out of the workforce. She is socially isolated and financially dependent on him. He controls decision-making, and her. They are not equals. She is dependent on him for everything. So she never tells anyone that he has started to hit her. She doesn't say anything to her family or friends. She grows more isolated. She has nothing else but him, so she lives with the violence until their story ends, one way or another. This story isn't a one-off. It's a story shared by 1 in 4 Australian women who have experienced physical or sexual violence from a current or former partner. And it's a story of 1 in 5 women since the age of 15 who experience sexual violence, including rape, 1 in 4 emotional violence, and 1 in 3 women physical violence. But it's also a story that affects children. More than half of the women who experienced violence had children in their care when the violence occurred. For victims and perpetrators, violence against women is the conclusion often reached after a life lived in a society where women and men aren't treated equally. But we, you and I, can change the narrative. Better education, policies, practices, support and funding can prevent this all too common story. When women and men have equal power, value, and opportunities in relationships and in society, violence against women is less likely. By nurturing caring, respectful, and equal relationships, and by creating equitable and inclusive communities, workplaces, and institutions, we can create a society of equality and respect, where violence against women is unthinkable. Let's change the story, because ending violence against women starts with gender equality.